Bonjour friends, hi students, my name is Lalit Rao and in today's video I am going to talk to you about 10 major French writers of 20th century who have represented French literature. So dear friends, the French literature of 20th century developed in a tumultuous period which saw two world wars, communist and fascist governments and a difficult decolonization. During this period, French literature also saw its status evolve under the effect of technological transformations such as paperback editions or competition from other leisure activities such as cinema, television and internet. The readers also witnessed in parallel a progressive dilution of aesthetic and intellectual trends after the period of surrealism, existentialism and nouveau. In this video, I will talk about 10 most important writers who are considered to be true representatives of the French literature of 20th century. Albert Camus is our first writer. Albert Camus was born in 1913 and he died in 1960. Albert Camus was a thought leader for the youth. Some of the most common themes of his books, such as evil, freedom and revolt, remain very contemporary and continue to nourish the reflection of a young public thirsty for a role model. Albert Camus was also a comprehensible philosopher who used both the novel and the theatre to put across the philosophical message. For example, L'Étranger depicts the absurd and leads to the love of life. La Peste raises the problem of evil and incites to revolt. Albert Camus won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1957. Among his famous works, one can cite works such as La Peste, L'Étranger, Les Justes, La Chute, Caligula, Le Mythe de Sisyphe, L'Envers et l'Endroit, Nos and L'Homme Révolté. André Gide is our second writer who was born in 1869 and who died in 1951. André Gide is hailed in glowing terms as the thought leader of a generation, a committed writer, an ambiguous and immoral moralist, the precursor to nouveau, and a neoclassical writer. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1947. Among his famous works are books such as Les Faux Monnayer, Si le grain ne meurt, La Symphonie pastorale, La Porte étroite, Les Moralistes, Les Caves du Vatican, Les Nourritures terrestres. According to his autobiography, Si le grain ne meurt, published in 1926, Gide's vocation as a writer was conceived at a very early age. As a writer, Gide experimented with forms of lyricism, allegory, parody and satire before fixing on a form of iconic first-person narrative which he called récit. He made récit a regular feature of many of his works such as Les Moralistes, La Porte étroite, La Symphonie pastorale and L'École des Femmes. At 46 years of age, Gide published Les Faux Monnayer in 1925, which he considered to be his unique novel. It showed the young intellectual middle class torn between the respect of Christian values and the search for personal emancipation. Some of the major themes of Les Faux Monnayer include middle class hypocrisy, call to rebellion and free act. Gide is also known for the famous novel La Symphonie pastorale, published in 1990. It is about a pastor who confuses Christian charity with sensual love and suffers its consequences. This novel was adapted for cinema in 1946 by French director Jean Delannoy. The Symphonie Pastorale starred Michel Morgan, Pierre Blanchard and Jean Desailly. André Malraux is our third writer. André Malraux was a crucial thinker. André Malraux was a crucial thinker as well as a committed novelist. His life and works are closely tied to the history of his century. During the 1930s, he was a prominent anti-fascist, and in 1934, he went with André Gide to Berlin to petition Goebbels. After the war, he shifted away from the left, abandoning any sympathy with communism and becoming a strong personal admirer of General Charles de Gaulle. Malraux was the Minister of Cultural Affairs for 10 years, 1959 to 1969, and created Maison de la Culture and initiated the cleaning of some of the most famous monuments of Paris. Malraux began writing essays and short stories in the 1920s, heavily influenced by the contemporary movements of Cubism, Dadaism, and to a lesser extent, surrealism. In 1928, Malraux published a first novel dedicated to the political situation in China, Les Conquérants. His second novel, La Voie Royale, inspired from his Indochina adventures, was published in 1930. His third novel, La Condition Humaine, published in 1933, talks about the destiny of men, solitude and revolution. It was very well received and won the Goncourt Prize. It was one of the first novels to make communist adventure into a romantic adventure. Death, the passage of time, old age, physical incapacity, social constraints, the individual's own past, all combined in Malraux's novels to form the weight of a destiny which only fraternity, human dignity and the sacrifice of individual interest to a greater extent can begin to alleviate. Some of his famous works are La Condition Humaine, L'Espoir, La Métamorphose des Dieux, Les Noyés de l'Altenbourg. Finally, Malraux once described his aim as being to donner aux hommes quelques images de la grandeur humaine. Our fourth writer is the famous dramatist Eugène Ionesco, who was born in 1912 and who died in 1994. Eugène Ionesco was a French dramatist who was elected to French Academy in 1970. Some of his famous plays are La Cantatrice Chauve, La Leçon, Les Chauves, Le Roi se meurt, Jeu de Massacre. He has been described as a pessimist thinker, he has been described as a pessimist prankster, a creator of an absurd and solitary world, as well as a committed playwright. In 1950, the presentation of La Cantatrice Chauve, the bald soprano, created a stir in Parisian theatrical world. It was a ferocious parody of contrived sentences like those one reads in a textbook teaching a foreign language. Language breaks down completely in La Cantatrice Chauve, and its dialogues consist of platitudes and nonsensical statements. Some of the recurrent themes of Ionesco's plays are nostalgia for a luminous childhood, and interest in the phenomenon of language, and the relativity of received ideas, and an aversion to ideology. Ionesco's later plays become longer and more ambiguous. The protagonist of Le Rhinocéros, published in 1960, is an individual caught up in a conformist society. This was a play with distinct political implications and shows men degenerating under totalitarianism into insentient beasts. Ionesco was once attacked for his lack of social or political purpose. He replied that a playwright simply writes plays. Finally, this stance helped to define him as a writer concerned only to communicate his personal anguish rather than to engage in an ideological debate. Our next writer is the famous French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who was born in 1905 and who died in 1980. Jean-Paul Sartre was a major French philosopher, novelist and dramatist. He was an existentialist writer known for his aggressive writing. As a committed writer, Sartre wrote works such as La Nausée, Huis clos, Les mots, Les mains sales, Les mouches, Les murs, etc. Although Sartre is indebted to philosophers Husserl and Heidegger as a philosopher, however, his own version of existentialism constitutes an original philosophical system which rests on the premise of atheism, where God is dead as the necessary basis of ethics. For Sartre, artistic creation must be a moral activity, and literature, if it is to exist at all, has to be committed. Sartre's first novel, La Nausée, published in 1938, and his collection of short stories, Le Mur, brought him immediate recognition. In his most successful philosophical work, L'être et le néant, published in 1943, Sartre explores the condition of man with regard to himself, the exterior world, and other individuals. Sartre's central notion of the committed writer is made clear in his plays. They deal with moral issues without being problem plays. For example, in Les Mouches, published in 1943, the young killer's freedom is pitted against the powerless Jupiter. In Huis clos, the hell is presented as the inescapable but necessary judgment of others. Sartre was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1964, but he denied it. Louis Ferdinand Chéline is our next writer, who was born in 1894 and he died in 1961. Louis Ferdinand Chéline was a curse writer, an apocalyptic novelist, and a brilliant stylist. For the last part of his life and the early years following his death, Céline's reputation was overshadowed by the public's perception of him as a fascist, a collaborator, and an anti-Semite. His most famous novel, Voyage au bout de la nuit, was published in 1932. It was an episodic novel in the picaresque tradition which conveyed a pessimistic vision of the 20th century, with its anti-hero Bartholomew and his alter ego Robinson through World War I, the industrial suburbs of Paris, the French African colonies, New York and Detroit. Some of its major themes concern the denunciation of the society, wandering, friendship and love. Voyage au bout de la nuit was hailed as a major political novel in 1930s by both left and right alike. Céline's last works have an autobiographical character. They evoked the period when he escaped the liberated France between July 1944 and March 1945. Finally, serious and interested readers can learn more about Céline by reading his works such as Voyage au bout de la nuit, Les Beaux Draps, Moracredi, and D'un Château à l'Autre. Now we move on to our next writer, a great writer who has written one of the most important novels of the 20th century. Ladies and gentlemen and my dear friends, I am talking about Marcel Proust, who was born in 1871 and who died in 1922. Marcel Proust became a legend in French literary circles long before his death. His work, À la recherche du temps perdu, The Quest for Lost Time, is perhaps the biggest French novel of 20th century. It is located halfway between fiction and autobiography. Numerous experiences which Proust lived appear in it. The narrator writes Je. Thus the novel takes the form of an autobiography. This novel narrates the existence of a future writer from his childhood until the moment when he begins to write the book, which we read in its original French. It appeared in 16 volumes between 1913 and 1927. The last 5 years after Proust's death, The Quest for Lost Time was written in a stream of consciousness style and contains 3,000 pages. Proust was indebted to great French philosopher Henri Bergson, who developed the distinction between mechanical and psychological time. Born in the first year of the Third Republic, the young Marcel, like his narrator, was a delicate child from a bourgeois family. He was active in Parisian high society during the 80s and 90s and welcomed in the most fashionable and exclusive salon of his day. Proust continued to work with an almost inhuman dedication on his masterpiece right up until his death in 1922 at the age of 51. Today he is widely recognized as one of the greatest authors of the 20th century and à la recherche du temps perdu as one of the most dazzling and significant works of literature to be written in modern times. Now we move on to another playwright, Samuel Beckett, who is one of the major writers of the 20th century. Beckett was born in 1906 and died in 1989. Samuel Beckett was an Irish-born playwright and novelist who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1969. Beckett was an unclassifiable solitary writer. As a technician of the interior monologue, he was the initiator of a different theatre. Among his famous works, one can cite plays such as En attendant Godot, published in 1953, Fin de Partie, and Oh le beau jour. When he was asked why he had chosen to write in French, Beckett replied that it made it easier to write without style. He was talking about his own style, that of a hyper-literate Irishman. There is the predominance of monologue in Beckett's fiction. His plays explore the medium of theatre using its every aspect, such as repeated performances and the ambiguous dividing line between stage and audience. Beckett took 4 months to write his masterpiece En attendant Godot, which was based in an after-war context. It was an absurd play which lasted 2 hours. It became an enormous success after being translated in more than 20 languages. Samuel Beckett is considered a literary genius as he was the leading figure in two of the most important developments of French writing in the period after World War II, the nouveau roman and the nouveau théâtre. Now we move on to one of the most important women writers of the 20th century, Marguerite Duras. Marguerite Duras was born in 1914 and died in 1996. Marguerite Duras was the most celebrated French woman writer of the late 20th century. She has produced over 50 plays, novels and films. In 1950, Duras published the novel Un barrage contre le Pacifique, an autobiographical novel with strong Indo-China influences. It talked about the flood disaster of her childhood. The novel had echoes of contemporary American writer and denounced the colonial system. Her experience with death is said to have inspired her novel L'Amo, written in 1984, which talks about Indo-China period. It won the Prix Goncourt and brought mass audience closer to Duras. In the context of French literature, Marguerite Duras is remembered as an artist on the fringes of nouveau roman, a writer who was also a cineast and atypical genius. Among her famous works, we can list novels such as L'Amo, Un barrage contre le Pacifique, Moderato Cantabile, Hiroshima Mon Amour, India Song, Nathalie Granger. Now we move on to the last and the most important French writer of the 20th century, Simone de Beauvoir, who was born in 1908 and who died in 1986. Simone de Beauvoir was a French writer, philosopher, and political activist. She is considered to be one of the major intellectual figures of the 20th century. She has been hailed as a leader of feminists. She is famous for her treatise, The Second Sex, written in 1948, and metaphysical novels She Came to Stay, published in 1943, and The Mandarins, published in 1954. Since 1929, she agreed to commit to an open relationship with French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, which lasted until Sartre's death in 1980. Both of them were communists who campaigned for the independence of Algeria and against torture. In the literary history, this literary couple joined other famous couples who were writers, namely George Sand and Alfred de Musset, and Louis Aragon and Elsa Triolet. With Le Deuxième Sexe, Simone de Beauvoir raised awareness by highlighting the alienation of women. This reflection, linked to militant actions, enabled the feminist movement of the 1970s to define its nature, its objectives, and its actions. So ladies and gentlemen, and my dear friends, my dear students, these were the 10 important writers of the 20th century. Now I'm going to show you how do they look like. So I'm going to open this folder and I will show you their photos. So here they are. So the first writer which I'm going to show you is Samuel Beckett. Next is Albert Camus. This is Marguerite Duras, who wrote the famous book L'Amant. This is André Gide. This is Eugène Ionesco. This is Jean-Paul Sartre. This is Louis Ferdinand Céline. This is André Malraux. This is Marcel Proust. And this is the last and the major writer of the 20th century, Simone de Beauvoir.